So today I have the great pleasure of speaking with Conor Heneghan, who's the Director of Research Algorithms in Fitbit, California. So hi Conor, how are you today?
I'm fine, thank you, Patricia. Thank you for the invitation to appear.
Well, it's our great pleasure, Conor. So first question for you today is, where are you located and how has life been for you during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Sure, I'm sitting in my home office, which is in San Jose, California. And life in COVID has been like everywhere else, quite a tough slog. We started shelter in place in early March, a couple of days actually before Ireland, and we've had our usual ups and downs of what you can and can't do.
Okay, so sounds very similar to what we've been experiencing. So Conor, you are the Director of Research Algorithms for Fitbit. Can you please tell our listeners about what smartwatches or trackers measure and why these wearables are such an interesting sector to work in right now?
Yeah, so smartwatches and trackers are devices you wear on your wrist, and they can tell you a lot of useful information about your health and wellness. So the core components inside a device are an accelerometer, which measures your movement. We have an optical sensor, which can measure your heart rate because it sees each pulse of blood as it goes by. And we also have things like altimeters, which can measure your altitude. So we use those raw sensors to do things like count your steps every day. So looking at your activity, we measure your heart rate continuously, 24 hours by 7. So that way you can look at like your resting heart rate, you can look at your heart rate while you run. And we also then can do things with the altimeter, like saying how many steps you've climbed in a day. And now in recent years, we've started adding in more health features. So we can do things like look for cardiac rhythm problems by looking at each individual heartbeat. We can also begin to estimate your sleep quality. So we measure your sleep and break it into different phases of sleep, like whether you're in deep sleep or REM sleep. And then more recently, we've actually started to do things like estimating the oxygen in your blood to give you a sense of your overall wellness, which might be particularly relevant right now in the COVID era.
Yeah, so I'm sure our listeners will have a lot of questions around that. So actually, I have one question around that. Is maybe you could give our audience and our listeners some examples of how people have used smartwatches and trackers to actually improve their health.
Yeah, so I'm going to give a very simple example because it's a very powerful example of behavior change. We have a feature in the Fitbit called a reminder to move. So being sedentary has been seen to be a big health risk. So we want to keep people moving. So the way a reminder to move works is that every hour, if you haven't achieved 250 steps, about 10 minutes before the hour, it will give you a little reminder, a little buzz in your wrist to say, please move. And you hopefully you hit your 250 steps for that hour. And what's fascinating about it is we actually went and tested this with 60,000 people. And we saw a 25% increase in the people who are sedentary. It increased their step and activity count by 25%. So the long-term impact of that on their health will be great.
Yeah, and I'm sure that made a big difference actually while everybody was isolating during COVID all around the world. And actually a question in relation to that, and it's really COVID has changed everything. So I'm just wondering, how has it changed your actual work? And has there been any unforeseen opportunities for Fitbit during this time?
Yes, I mean, from a day-to-day, obviously I'm working from home, as are most of my colleagues. One of the sort of most immediate impacts was we have a great lab in Fitbit where we do all of our testing on the final product. So testing the heart rate, testing the steps. So we've had to be very creative how to do that in the home environment. So that's been a very practical impact. And then I say in terms of new opportunities to kind of contribute, I already mentioned the link with COVID. We did a large study in the US and Canada. We asked people who had COVID to share their Fitbit data with us. And we were able to see some very interesting signs of changes in breathing rate, heart rate, and also the variation in your heart rate as a person develops the early signs of COVID. So we're trying to see if we can push that forward some more.
That's incredible. That's really interesting. And again, I am sure there's going to be a lot of questions around that. So just to finish my last of my 5 questions in 5 minutes, is what, Conor, makes you excited for the future of wearables? I suppose really what our audience would be interested in is in terms of health related features.
Yeah, I think wearables are maturing as a field, and we definitely are seeing more and more crossover into healthcare. So actually, it's a very opportune time to speak because earlier this week we just received the clearance from FDA in the United States and also clearance in the European Union to launch a feature on our latest smartwatch, which is an electrocardiogram check. So electrocardiogram is the electrical activity of your heart. And now with a 30-second sample from your smartwatch, you can detect a condition called atrial fibrillation, which is the most common cardiac arrhythmia. And this is sort of an example of what us and other wearable manufacturers are starting to do as the field matures.
That's really interesting. And just, I suppose, just a question, how accurate is that detection of atrial fibrillation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a highly accurate. So it's kind of the order of 99% accuracy. Yeah, so it has to be a pretty high standard to kind of reach the bar.
FDA approval. Yeah, exactly. I would have thought so. Okay, that's great, Conor. So now we've opened it up to the audience for the next 10 minutes, and we already have a lot of questions coming through. So the first one for you is, what has Fitbit learned over its time of collecting data? What has it learned about population trends?
Yeah, well, we could spend all day on that.
Okay.
So, I mean,
and I wonder, maybe could you talk about Ireland a little bit in that as well? I'm sure we'd be
yeah. I mean, just to give a sense of scale, I think Fitbit, we have of the order of, say, 30 million active users, so it's a pretty large set of data. So we can look at things like average heart rates, average sleep patterns, and so on. So I pull up some statistics for Ireland in relation to sleep, since that's an area I'm very interested in. So we'd be glad to know the average Irish Fitbit user sleeps about 437 minutes. At the beginning of COVID, it's gone down to about 420 minutes, as things maybe have got a little bit easier. And just compare that with the global average of 401. So the Irish sleeping about 20 minutes more than average of our global population. We're not the best. I think Australia and New Zealand have the highest, longest sleep durations. And the balance is really brought down, particularly by Japan and to some extent South Korea. They're unfortunately down at below 6 hours average sleep per night. So that's the type of thing you can learn from looking at data out of population. How you see these cultural effects.
And there's another question coming in related to that. So this is capturing sleep, but can it capture how well we're sleeping, and in terms of the deep sleep aspect of it, and how much deep sleep do we need, I suppose?
Yeah, so the trackers do break your sleep down into deep REM and light sleep, which are the different stages of sleep. Most adults probably should get sort of between 10 and 20% of their night as deep sleep. So like 1 to 2 hours will be good. So we do report that back to users. Yeah.
Okay. Here's a question for you. Will all your new Fitbits come with these new features that you've discussed? The atrial fibrillation detection, for example, or is that an optional extra?
In general, all of anything which is like a health feature, I think it will always be an opt-in, firstly. So we don't force people to use features they don't want to. I mean, I'm not direct in the product side. I'm not sure if we do provide devices at different prices. So it's possible that different price ranges mightn't have all the features, but in general, our general philosophy is if we can make it work, we make it work. So I will be hopeful that most features going forward will have that. Most products will have it. Yeah.
Okay, and here's a kind of a very different type of question. So it's a slightly long, so bear with me. It says patients referencing their Fitbit data can often be dismissed by their clinician. How would you see Fitbit and the medical profession working together more collaboratively in the future?
Yeah, I mean, we actually already do a lot of work with medical colleagues. So, for example, we discussed the atrial fibrillation feature. That was developed in collaboration with a bunch of clinicians, and we have a large ongoing study with the Massachusetts General Hospital as the principal investigators. We also partner with a BMS Pfizer, which is a large pharmaceutical company, to try and develop atrial fibrillation understanding and knowledge. So very much talking to the medical community is very much part of Fitbit's mission. And while I believe, obviously, there is skepticism, I think there's also growing acceptance that wearables have a role in general health. It's an extra pair of eyes for kind of medical people to keep an eye on their patients.
It's interesting because I just had a conversation earlier today, and we were talking about something similar, and just, more data that's available to the patients, almost the better, in terms of monitoring their own self-help. But so here's one. I'm using Fitbit for years. What are the challenges to moving from a step challenge to a calorie challenge? And there's another one just related to that is, do I need to do 10,000 steps? So maybe you can incorporate all of that.
All right. Well, thank you for using the product for a few years. Yeah, right now we have what are called step challenges, which either can be a solo or a group thing where you try to hit, say, consistently hit 20,000 steps or something like that, or maybe you try to compete in teams. We haven't actually brought that into a calorie challenge or any other. So I guess the calories is actually quite a hard one to estimate. There's probably a bigger range of error on calories than there might be on other metrics, because so much of calories depends upon your basal metabolic rate. So we don't want to. Also, I can see potentially a bit of kickback in calories as a target. We don't know what's
I'll agree with you there. Actually, as a biochemist, I must admit, as a biochemist by training, I would never count calories. So, but that's a whole different thing. But in relation to the 10,000 steps and I suppose looking, so here's another question. In terms of we mentioned sleep in relation to different countries, but here's a question about healthiest, unhealthiest, like in terms of their movement and their steps, and how do the Irish fare in general in relation to that?
So firstly, just to go back to the 10,000 steps, it's kind of a cute story. Everyone's thinking it's a very scientifically derived metric. It was actually a Japanese company in 1965 that came out with the first pedometer, or one of the first ones, and they just called it the 10,000 step in Japanese, like something like Mohomba Kai or something. So there was no great. It was more a marketing cute name. But it actually turns out to be a pretty decent metric. Our average users around the world, I think about 8,600 steps is the average. So 10,000 is a nice thing. It's just a little bit more than most people, the average, so it's a good target to have. And plus you can change your target internally in the device. And then in terms of comparing different countries, Ireland is towards the top end in terms of physical activity, and also things like looking at average resting heart rates. So Ireland is definitely one of the more active and fitter countries. And I think the general trend we see is, unfortunately, the hotter the country, the harder it is to get your steps in. So I see countries like Saudi Arabia and India tend to have the lower steps. And I say we mostly ascribe that to the fact that it's probably incredibly difficult in the middle of the day in Saudi Arabia to go for a nice casual walk. So yeah, that seems to be I would say in general, the more northern or southern, in the case of New Zealand, probably have an advantage in terms of physical activity day to day.
Okay, and what's the most steps you've ever seen, or what's the kind of like most steps anybody's ever done, or would you know?
We had a discussion internally on that. I don't have an exact figure, but we think it's just over 200,000.
My, okay, it wasn't me anyway.
So
and that's in one day.
That's in one day, yeah. I mean, there are people who do these 100-mile crazy races, so we think that they're the ones who can potentially achieve that in one day. Yeah.
Okay, so just there's lots of questions coming in, but just to kind of change tack slightly. So it's about data and the data being collected. So here's one: do any people report becoming anxious or obsessive as a result of the constant monitoring?
I mean, I've seen this written about it. I personally is not something that we've a lot of experience with in our kind of customer service. Obviously, like everything, there's always you can do too much of something. You can obsess about your statistics. I mean, we would definitely recommend people not to obsess about their statistics. This is a device that's supposed to help people, not hinder. I mean, if for some reason someone was getting stressed out about it, we could,
okay,
that will be something they should probably discuss with their doctor. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I suppose we're running out of time, but I suppose there's one here on data and you know, the fact now, what do you do with all the data you collect, and also the fact that you're owned, I suppose now in collaboration with Google. So how can you assure people that their data is private and everything that's being collected is private?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one thing there, apart from the technology, is the kind of culture of the company. So the two founders really been very clear that the data is not Fitbit's data; it's the individual's data, and we're kind of looking after for them in the cloud. We don't sell our data for any kind of advertising, marketing, targeting. It's very much the only legitimate use of data from a cultural point of view is that will help the person. We're not actually part of Google. There is a process going on where Google put in a bid to buy Fitbit, and that's going through various authorities right now from a kind of regulatory point of view. So we're still an independent company. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a really nice way to finish, and because we're unfortunately out of time, so sincere apologies to all of those whose questions I didn't get to. But I just wanted to finally take this opportunity to say a huge thank you to Conor for the most fascinating discussion today. Thank you so much, Conor.
You're very welcome, and thanks for the invite again.
Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everyone else, our audience, for joining in today. So don't forget, we run these Zoom for Thoughts every Tuesday, so check out our website at zoomforthought.ie or sign up to our mailing list at discovery@ucd.ie. So thank you so much again, Conor, and thanks everyone. Have a great day and see you all next week on our Zoom for Thought. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.